I think when you're just in the community, the response that judges get versus other people kind of lends itself to showing that people believe that judges should have a certain amount of, it's kind of like unearned respect that you get.
Judges are literally on a pedestal, like physically
Yes,
elevated in a
absolutely,
courtroom.
absolutely.
And so it makes sense that our understanding of them is as elevated versions of us.
Right.
This woman is a judge in the juvenile legal system. While she has devoted most of her career to that system, she also sees major problems with it. Her proposed solution is controversial, so she has to remain anonymous. I don't know her name, and you won't either. For now, this is the only way she can share her experiences and continue to do her work.
Normal citizens don't know about the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system. And they definitely don't know about the juvenile justice system. It's totally different than the adult system in most places. And so, in the adult system, it's open. Anybody can come and watch it. You can come get records. Whereas the juvenile systems, most of the systems aren't necessarily open, and you don't hear about much information about what goes on in juvenile courts. And it's more of a cloud of secrecy sometimes. And so who knows what is supposed to happen and what actually happens?
An average human walking in would be like, yeah, a judge is supposed to have this level of power.
Absolutely.
My name is Sarah Kay, and this is Sincerely X from TED and Luminary Media. In each episode of the show, we hear the story of an anonymous person. We give light to an idea in hiding, and then we go deeper, exploring this idea with the help of others. In this episode, we'll explore the strange power that some judges, like our guest, hold in the juvenile legal system. It's a power that can allow judges to interpret the law and make policy as they see fit, even though their interpretation of the law is subjective. And they're able to do this with little oversight, accountability, or transparency into their work, even while their decisions impact the trajectory of young people's lives. Our guest thinks this amount of power is a problem and has serious consequences.
The judge has the ability to make all kind of policies for the court. If they want to determine that any kid that comes in to the court's jurisdiction with a gun charge, they can order that all kids, no matter what, serve a certain amount of time in the detention facility based on that drug charge. The judge has the ability to make a lot of wholesale decisions. I mean, the judge can decide that people who wear a certain outfit can't come to the courtroom. That's all within the authority of the judge. There's just a lot of power. When an attorney was in one of the detention facilities talking to their client and noticed another kid around, and I think either asked the child or somehow found out that the child was in there and had been there for quite some time on this violation of court order. And so they went to try and investigate it and figure out what was going on, but they didn't represent the child, and so they had no way to get access to the child's record. So then they decided to try and figure out, another way. They I think did some kind of just oral investigation, asked other kids what they were there for, and there were a handful of kids that were in this facility for violating court orders.
But ultimately, they were in there because they had skipped school or they had these status behavioral problems, not actual crimes.
Correct. The attorneys that were doing this investigation attempted to come into the courtroom and to take some of the cases just by pro bono and not being charged, and just wanted to try and help these children to understand what their rights were. And the court, and we have the authority to do this, particularly in juvenile court, decided that the courtroom would be closed. And so nobody could come in the courtroom.
So that they could just keep on with the same behavior.
Correct. That frustrates me to no end. First of all, that's not helpful for kids at all, or for our youth. That's not the answer for getting children back in the school system. Secondly, it gives judges a bad name. When that stuff comes to light, it puts us all in a bind. It says, judges, when behind closed doors, these judges will do anything.
Did you approach that judge?
I did not.
Would you ever?
Probably not in the position that I'm in.
Why not?
I don't know if it's just a very personal fear. And, I don't even know what the retribution could be. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical why other judges, or me particular, should not be able to call out other judges if you think that they're doing something wrong. And it is bothersome because if I, as a judge, have a fear of turning another judge in that I believe is doing something that's wrong, then how do you expect the people that are in front of them to feel? And then I also, for me personally, think that there's some demographical reasons why it's difficult to step up and say things.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So when you think about your typical judge, there's a perception of what they look like.
And what do they look like?
Old white men. And so it's difficult if you're not in the old white men category or in the accepted or known demographic of what a judge is. It's difficult to stand up, I guess.
So can you tell me what kind of oversight a judge in the juvenile legal system has?
And, I think for both in any type of system, whether it's criminal, juvenile, circuit, all the way up to the Supreme Court, there's not much oversight. So on the lower levels of court, like for instance, the juvenile courts, there's the ability to appeal a decision to a higher court. And so at most, you have that right for appeal, for there to be any kind of oversight. And, no judge likes to have a Supreme Court or a Court of Appeals decision saying that they did something wrong. And so, in a sense, so that's the most oversight that you get. But if people don't appeal cases or don't make any type of argument against what a judge may have decided, that's it. It's gone. It's over. That's decision. And so, in some sense, I definitely see why people would not want to challenge a judge because of the position.
It sounds like the appeal process really only comes into play after the fact.
Correct.
And to appeal a judge's decision requires a lot of time and money.
Definitely a lot of money.
And not a lot of people can afford to make an appeal.
Right. I definitely agree with that.
And so if that's the only kind of check and balance or oversight that a person would have access to after the fact, it seems more likely that most people would not do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that means that for the most part, judges can do and will do what they want with the confidence that they will not be challenged on it.
Correct. And you have to think about it too in the system. Attorneys specialize in some sense in a certain area of law. And so if you're, for instance, an attorney who loves to do criminal law, and that's the only thing that you do, and so you're in front of the only judge or limited number of judges on a constant basis, if you challenge them on a regular basis, then you're thinking, well, they're going to remember that I appealed them. And this is where I get my bread and my butter from. This is the judge that I'm going to be in front of each and every time. I may not be as eager to file an appeal.
While juvenile judges do have a unique amount of power with little oversight, it does vary from state to state. Even within a single jurisdiction, practices can vary from judge to judge. One judge might see fit to try a young person as an adult, while another judge might choose to approach that same case differently.
So there's a system, and it depends on what state you're in. If depending on the charge, a child can be tried as an adult. Well, within the space that I'm in, there was an article that this particular judge had 1 year, like 90 something cases that were transferred to the adult system. And the demographics of our areas are fairly the same. And so, there became a question of how can that be that different and that far apart? And it was a philosophical difference that if kids are going to do these serious things, then they just need to be tried as adults. In my opinion, there wasn't enough of a look into why kids were doing these things. Was it peer pressure? Would they ever do it again? Just because they commit or are a part of or commit a serious offense one time doesn't mean that we need to absolutely throw their lives away and send them to the adult system. There's opportunities for some of them that they could be rehabilitated still yet within the juvenile system. And we know that to be true based on what the scientists say about the brain studies and the brain development.
And just to be really explicit, what do you see as the problem with charging minors as adults?
The likelihood of them being forever tragically changed because they're with, adults is super high. And, we as a country, as a system, do that more for our young people than anybody, even though everything that you can read about brain sciences says that those children can change.
And why do you think that's the case? Even when given that science and even when
I don't think they
shown.
believe it. And let me also say, incarceration and giving up on people is super easy versus working on being restorative, working on being creative, on finding a way to rehabilitate based on brain science. That stuff is hard to do. It's time consuming. It requires just more thought process. It requires hard conversations, letting a victim and an offender sit together and talk through things is difficult. Sometimes in my mind, it's also a thought of why go through all this? We can just do this and get it over with.
What our guest is describing is a process called restorative justice. Restorative justice is a different approach to justice that focuses on accountability and the rehabilitation of the accused through community involvement. Because the process is conducted with and visible to the community, this means power is redistributed. The judge is no longer the sole authority on what justice should look like.
My vision is to be kind of a light for other judges in the sense that if I can show them that, the things that they may be doing aren't good and don't help, and I can show them in a way where other things are better and more helpful, and you get better reduction of recidivism, you get less crime and other things. My hope is to show them that it works a different way and to really just hope that they open their eyes and become more open and flexible about doing things a better way.
So you're trying to lead by example.
Correct, yes. I'll say, for instance, there was an effort by a large committee that included a few judges on it, prosecutors, police, all that dealt with juvenile court issues that came together and gave some recommendations on ways to make the system more standardized and more fair for everybody. For instance, one of the recommendations were the judges would have to show efforts of trying to do treatment rehabilitation in the child's community, at least 3 times before a child could be locked up in a facility. It felt like that takes away our ability to determine when a sentence is appropriate for our children. And for me, it was a good thing. And I was like, yeah, we all should be on the same page. We all should be working to keep children in the community and provide them resources. This is something, yes, I'm okay with them taking away some of our power for the purpose of us having more consistent ways of treating our children.
What was the reaction to that from everybody else?
They would not support the effort because, bottom line, it took away the power that they had.
Can you tell me, what is it you're doing differently than those judges?
I'm definitely doing restorative justice and doing cases that could possibly bring, victim community offenders together. We're doing it. We're trying it. I'm not automatically just transferring kids based on their charges. I'm actually listening to the cases to hear why they got these charges and to hear more about their background, their ability to be rehabilitated. Just trying to truly take youth as they are as individuals and treat them as individuals and to figure out which ones that I truly believe we have an opportunity to make a difference in their lives.
And it sounds like the emphasis is much more on healing as
Absolutely.
opposed to prescribing a blanket punishment regardless of the specifics of the case.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm. So, do you feel like you're the only one who feels the way you do?
I'm sure I'm not, but some days I do feel that way.
And so, how are you perceived by other judges? Do they think you're a total radical, or because you keep it pretty quiet, that you're the Clark Kent behind the work you're doing to keep kids out of jail?
I'm a total radical.
This is Sincerely X. I'm Sarah Kay. In the beginning of this episode, we heard from a judge in the juvenile legal system who feels that judges like her have too much power with too little accountability or transparency. To address this, our guest has started to incorporate restorative justice practices into her courtroom. To understand this better, I turned to Sujata Balega. She's a former attorney, and now
I'm the director of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice.
At Impact Justice, she works with communities and jurisdictions across the nation to help people build community-based restorative justice programs. So, to begin with, can you tell me how you define restorative justice?
So Howard Zehr, who's known as the grandfather of restorative justice by some, he talks about restorative justice being a process to involve or an approach to justice that involves, to the extent possible, all those who have a stake in a specific offense in order to identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to put things as right as possible. So instead of asking the questions, what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished, the questions instead are, who was harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And he has some more questions, including what are the causes, which is something that we really don't think about so much in our criminal legal system, right? And I think that the gift that restorative justice gives us is a few more steps along the way to the potential for reconciliation, which involves, truth telling, deep truth telling, in which we've removed the barriers to truth telling by removing punitiveness. And then we can get to truth telling that leads to supported accountability that then may lead to things like forgiveness and reconciliation, or may not. We can't expect that survivors will necessarily let go of their anger. That's their own journey. But what we can do is support people to make things as right as possible. In the more severe crimes, including murder cases, we're never going to be able to make that totally right. No one is going to be able to be brought back from the dead. In other cases, people have had formative, important years of their childhood totally destroyed, right? And you never get another childhood. And at the same time, there are things that can be done that can lift layers of the suffering off of us. And often those things can only come from the person who harmed you. Sort of in the most extreme example is that no one can tell you what your child's last words were, except for the person who took their life. And for some people, those kinds of answers are really important to their own healing journey.
Here's an example of how restorative justice might play out.
So let's imagine that a young person breaks into a house in the neighborhood and steals some things of value. And a community-based organization is trained in working with that young person and with the person whose things they stole. And understanding from the person whose things were stolen, whose home was burglarized, how are they harmed? What do they need now? What does getting those needs met look like? How can that young person be engaged in order to be responsible for making things right? And then we work with the young person to help prepare them for a face-to-face meeting supported by family and community. We pull in the family members that want to support community members. And ultimately, there's a direct dialogue between the person who had their things stolen and the young person. And they collectively come up with a plan where the young person does what is identified by the survivor of the crime to repair the harm that's been done. So, for example, someone may simply need to know, where is my stuff? Did you take my grandmother's ring to a pawn shop? Can we get it back, right? Or, where did you leave the car that you stole? Because there were some really important things in the trunk that are precious to me. And it's only that young person who has done that, right, that who has taken the car or taken the ring, that can tell us the answers to those questions. And so outcomes in cases look different every single time.
It's not cookie cutter
No.
that every crime in a certain category gets the same outcome.
Exactly. And it's also not centered around punishing the young person. It's about increasing the dignity and the well-being of everyone involved. And so it's not about a young person, steals some things and then is suddenly, deemed a pariah and labeled a juvenile delinquent. And we don't use any of that terminology, right? We say that this is the responsible youth. They are responsible for the thing they did wrong, and they are going to show us that they're a responsible young person at the end of this when they make it right. And we're going to show them that we are responsible for supporting them in that process.
Can you tell me how difficult it is to have those conversations?
I think it depends on your comfort with hard conversations. And if we approach difficult conversations with an open and warm heart, and when we start with, this is, a terrible thing that you've done, and now we're coming in here to do an accountability process on you, rather than let's get to know you, and let's bring people into this conversation that believe in you, and let's find out how we can collectively move forward. How can we walk with you to make this right? When we start there, it's not as hard as you would think it would be. What's interesting is that a lot of kids are just waiting for us to ask them, how are you doing? And the answer is usually not so great. Violence doesn't start, or harms like that don't start with that incident. And young people really need to be supported to be able to tell us what's going on with them. Similarly, on the side of the survivor of the crime, when folks are harmed, we usually come to them with this is what the state can or cannot do for you, instead of starting with what happened and how has that impacted you. Answers are different with every single case. Some cars are just a car, and some cars that are stolen was the car that your dad gave to you the week before he passed away unexpectedly. Those conversations are hard in a sense, is that we need to take really good care of ourselves as restorative justice facilitators so that we can hold all those stories. But they're not as hard as uh, when I was a victim advocate working with the system, or when I was an attorney, where we were always only offering people a limited set of things that were predetermined. Helping someone navigate through a predetermined set of outcomes that often have nothing to do with what's actually needed is a much harder process than sitting and being present to what is arising naturally.
I know that, like, when I spoke with our anonymous guest, she talked about the way that behavioral issues that are not crimes but are behavioral get criminalized often. And how does restorative justice, shift that, or does it?
I think we need to have a multifold approach. In New Zealand, the behavioral stuff wouldn't even end up in restorative justice. It would not be charged. No one would even be arrested for the behavioral stuff. So we need different approaches for the more lower level things that I think families and communities need to be resourced in order to help young people not do the behavioral stuff that isn't beneficial for their long-term well-being. So I would like to see restorative justice reserved in the way it is in New Zealand for significant harms and crimes. A lot of young people in this country don't get locked up for the original harm that they did. They get locked up for probation violations. So once you're on probation, or you have an ankle monitor, or you don't show up on time for a meeting with a probation officer, then you can get locked up for that sort of thing. I mean, what child isn't late? I'm still late all the time. Like, I often think about like how onerous probation is and how I would just fail it terribly if I were on probation. And you can be incarcerated for those kinds of things. And I think we also need to do a lot of deep thinking about the ways in which these laws are disproportionately enforced by the number of police officers we have patrolling communities of color. And it's sort of this endless loop of kids getting caught up in stuff that other kids would never even be surveilled for.
Research conducted by Impact Justice and Community Works West found that within a year of completing a restorative justice program, youth were 44% less likely to get a new sustained charge. So if restorative justice has such positive outcomes, why do you think so many people in the criminal legal and juvenile legal system are either hesitant about it or sometimes even refuse outright, even when given that data?
I think systems are in the habit of reifying themselves. If all you have is a hammer, then everything's going to be a nail. And that's, I think, that's the position we put police and prosecutors and judges into, that all we give them is hammers. It is a big shift when we have given people hammers to say, put your hammers down. We have this other way. Welcome to the circle. And I think that that's really hard for a lot of prosecutors and judges. And I think what we do is sometimes we come in and we tell them what you are doing is bad and wrong and you have failed and you are a bad person. Stop locking up our kids. And, nobody's going to sign up for that, right? And what they are seeing every day is really horrible cases coming across their desk. And sometimes not horrible, but again, all they have is a hammer. And so they've got their hammer glasses on. And so what they see is that they need to hammer some things. And so I think the approach needs to be one in which we come to prosecutors and police officers and judges, right, from a place of understanding that, listen, you guys are trying to do a thing and we're here to help you because the outcome you are seeking is safer communities.
Let's talk a little bit about our guest. And you probably know and see a lot more than the average person about this topic. But was there anything that she said that surprised you, or was hearing from a judge surprising?
I don't think it's surprising, actually, from my perspective, right? I hear lots of judges and lots of prosecutors say similar things. One of the things that's most challenging is the fact that it is difficult for people within a single industry of any kind, really, to call each other out. And that, she's trying to be an example. And I see a handful of prosecutors and judges across the nation trying to be an example of, hey, business as usual wasn't working. Just using the hammer is not working, right? Or using a hammer at all is not working. And we need to find another way of doing things. And so that's I think a difficult position for her to be in, to have to sort of stay within the box and critique folks who are operating the way the box is designed to operate.
What are some of the structures that you have seen that are, I guess, effective in taking power away from the judges while still honoring their profession?
So there are a few different structures that could exist. One is that the community could actually be resourced to solve their own harms without even the police being called in the first place, right? That's a structure, actually. Resourced communities are structures. I know that in Eugene, Oregon, there's this thing called cahoots, and you can call them instead of calling 911 when you have a mental health crisis happening in your home, right? So that is one way that we could do this, is to actually have families, communities resourced to heal their own harms without reliance on systems that are unskilled in doing. So I think one of the biggest struggles is for our systems partners to say, I am not resourced to do this. When we have put them in the position of having to have all the answers, and they do not have the answers. Families and communities have answers if they're properly resourced to do the right thing, to support young people. When I hear a grandmother tell a young person what it is that she hopes and dreams for them, I see a light turn on in their eyes in ways that me as the facilitator, service providers, and certainly judges and prosecutors will never get to see. They never get to see a kid wake up and go, oh, this judge believed in me for this 15 minutes that I was in their courtroom, and now I'm going to turn my life around. That is such a rare story. The real story is my uncle got involved in my life again, and he started letting me work at his auto body shop after I was stealing and stripping cars because he saw how good I was at it. And he said, let me give you a job. And that's what changes a young person's life, right? So I think that's the direction that we need to be moving into. Let judges and prosecutors and police officers the freedom to say, the tools I have been given by these systems work to the opposite outcome of what we're trying to achieve. And I am at a loss for what to do, because what we have been doing for decades is literally making things worse.
To me, the idea that, like, if a youth misbehaves or if a youth commits a crime, the notion that that youth should be held accountable by people who know them from the community and involving those folks as authorities on who this person is and what should happen makes a lot of sense to me. I also can hear in my head the argument that, yeah, but that would make it so much easier to give the perpetrator the benefit of the doubt. So how do we convince folks that, like, actually what we're doing is actually a more responsible, measured way of approaching this?
Interestingly, restorative justice is actually often harder than standing in a court and just having to nod your head and say yes or no, and not be asked to actually be accountable for the thing that you did, right? Sitting in a jail sucks, right? But it isn't the same thing as having to look the person in the eyes whose stuff you stole, or who, you got in a really brutal fight with. And the outcomes are unknown, and that's really nerve-wracking. And so in some ways, restorative justice is not soft. It is at base an accountability model. It is the community that collectively comes up with the outcome of what happens. And who is in that circle is the person who was harmed and their supporters, right? So that is what keeps the thing balanced. There's this notion that judges are supposed to know the law, but they don't necessarily know healing. And, being objective and neutral might be beneficial to determining whether or not the statute is being properly applied, but it doesn't help people understand how to help us move forward in a good way based on the specificities of this particular group of people. And so what we need to know is that people helping hold that space, the restorative justice facilitator, is really about holding that space with equal compassion for each person and a desire for everyone to be doing better in the end. And that doing better in the end as a person who's done harm means not continuing to do harm. And so what do we have to do to set that up so that that young person is actually given the structure and the support that they need in order to make this right and not do it again?
I love the idea that judges might be experts on the legal system, but not necessarily experts on healing, and certainly not experts on someone else's personal experience, because you are the expert on your personal experience. And so when someone has been the victim of a crime or of a harm, to be able to allow them to be the expert on that experience and be the authority on what they need in order to heal and move forward, and what accountability is going to look like for them, is incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. It's okay to help create a task force, a community, including community members, a task force of some kind that involves prosecutor systems partners, et cetera, to explore the application of a thing, right? You don't have to come out with your banner waving if that is something that's impossible for you. But what you can do is, have focus groups within your own ranks. Bring in people to start to share the idea, to start to co-create something that doesn't feel as threatening. Rely on the community to say, hey, this isn't working for us. And remember that everyone who's been a public servant, right? We are servants to the community. And that you're allowed to fall back on that and say, hey, this isn't working. I am here for the community. And what we see is this isn't working. And to understand that at some point, there's going to be a place where you've buttressed yourself with enough data and enough voices, and those voices of the community are data, to say this isn't working and that it is okay to start to make that shift. It is okay to start to let go of that level of power and control, which isn't good for any of us.
Sincerely X is produced by Magnificent Noise for TED and Luminary Media. Our production staff includes Eva Walchover, Noor Wazwaz, Destry Sibley, Kim Naderfane-Petersa, and Chloe Shasha, with the help of Angela Chang, Janet Lee, Michelle Quint, Jesse Baker, and Colin Helms. Our fact checker is Lorena Aviles Trujillo. This episode was mixed and sound designed by Kristen Muller. Our executive producer is Eric Newsom. If you or someone you know has a story that you think should be shared anonymously with others, please let us know at ted.com/sincerelyx. I'm Sarah Kay, and this is Sincerely X.